When we think of notorious unsolved murders, the name Jack the Ripper immediately comes to mind. We imagine foggy London streets and a phantom who vanished into history. But years before the terror in Whitechapel, a far more brutal predator was already stalking the streets of America. Wherever this shadowy figure went, a gruesome midnight slaughter followed, leaving victims lifeless in their own beds while authorities remained completely baffled. Welcome back to the channel. Today we step into a dark winter to uncover the chilling, forgotten mystery of America's first serial killer. The year was 1884, and the city of Austin, Texas, stood at the precipice of a modern era, caught halfway between its rugged frontier, past, and a prosperous, civilized future. The state capital was rapidly transforming into a bustling metropolis, driven by a booming economy and the arrival of the railroad. Gas lamps were beginning to illuminate the newly paved main thoroughfares, while grand Victorian mansions with sweeping porches were being erected to house the city's rising political and financial elite. Yet, just a few steps away from this glittering progress, a different world existed. The back alleys and narrow dirt paths remained unlit, steeped in deep shadows where the old, untamed violence of the West still lingered. It was a city divided by stark lines of class and race, providing a perfect fragmented hunting ground for a predator who knew exactly how to navigate the darkness unseen. Among the thousands of working-class citizens laboring to sustain this growing wealth was Molly Smith, a 25-year-old African-American cook. Like countless other domestic workers in the Victorian era, Molly's life was defined by grueling physical labor and quiet survival. She worked from dawn until dusk for a prosperous white family, preparing meals, scrubbing floors, and managing the relentless demands of a large household. Her only sanctuary was a tiny, poorly insulated servants' quarters located in the rear courtyard behind her employer's grand estate. These small wooden structures offered little comfort and even less security, serving merely as a place to collapse after a 14-hour shift. By the time the lamps were extinguished in the main house, the heavy exhaustion in Molly's bones practically guaranteed a deep, dreamless sleep. The winter of that year was particularly brutal, plunging the usually temperate Texas landscape into a bitter, freezing chill. The night of December 30th, 1884, brought an unnatural quiet to the streets, as dropping temperatures forced residents to retreat early to the warmth of their indoor hearths. The city was soon enveloped in a profound, icy silence, with a fresh layer of snow covering the ground and reflecting the pale moonlight. Inside her cramped, dark quarters, Molly had retired for the evening, burying herself under heavy quilts to ward off the biting cold. She was entirely alone, isolated from the main house, and completely unaware that a silent observer had already selected her as his first offering. Sometime well after midnight, the terrifying tranquility of the winter night was shattered by the sudden, violent splintering of wood. The flimsy door of Molly's cabin was forced inward with overwhelming, brutal strength, tearing the hinges from the frame and letting the freezing night air rush into the small room. Before the young cook could fully wake from her deep slumber, process the intrusion, or scream for help, a shadowy figure loomed directly over her bed. He was armed with a heavy, sharp axe, a common, mundane tool found sitting beside firewood in almost every Austin backyard. With terrifying precision and a savage, calculated force, the phantom brought the iron blade down, striking her skull and ending her life in a sudden eruption of unimaginable violence. However, the brutal killing itself was not enough to satisfy this intruder. He possessed a dark, twisted compulsion that would soon become his horrific signature. Rather than dropping his weapon and fleeing the bloody scene to avoid detection, the killer took his time. He grabbed the young woman's lifeless body and dragged her forcibly out of the bed. He pulled her across the rough wooden floorboards and out the broken doorway into the biting winter air, leaving a dark crimson trail soaking into the fresh snow. He finally abandoned her mutilated remains in the freezing yard, deliberately staging the horrifying tableau to be discovered by the waking world long before the morning sun could rise. When the gruesome discovery was made the following morning, the violent scene sent a brief, chilling ripple through the immediate neighborhood. Local authorities were summoned, but in the racially segregated and prejudiced society of 1880s Texas, the murder of an African-American domestic servant did not command the full, rigorous attention of the police force. Investigators conducted a superficial examination of the chaotic scene and hastily concluded that this was merely a tragic, isolated crime of passion. Ignoring the terrifying implications of the broken door and the staging of the body, they quickly arrested a man who had previously been romantically involved with Molly. The police were entirely confident that they had swiftly resolved a simple, albeit bloody, domestic dispute. The affluent citizens of Austin read the brief, dismissive reports in the local newspapers, locked their heavy oak doors, and went about their comfortable lives without a second thought. They believed the nightmare was over before it even truly began. They couldn't have been more wrong. As the bitter frost of winter thawed into the sweltering Texas spring of 1885, the fragile illusion of safety in Austin melted away with it. The police had confidently closed the book on Molly Smith's brutal demise, but the shadows of the city held a different truth. The violence was not an isolated tragedy. It was merely a dark overture. Over the next several months, the bloody nocturnal strikes escalated with a terrifying rhythm. Plunging the capital into a state of sustained hysteria, the unseen predator had cultivated a highly specific and disturbing appetite. His targets were exclusively African-American domestic workers, vulnerable women, who lived in the isolated, flimsy servant quarters behind the sprawling estates of their employers. In early May, a cook named Eliza Shelley was discovered butchered in her tiny cabin, her skull cleaved by a heavy blade. Just a few months later, the phantom struck again, claiming the life of Irene Cross in a similarly savage late-night home invasion. The marginalized women who formed the backbone of the city's domestic labor force were suddenly being hunted for sport. It was the chilling consistency of these midnight attacks that began to form a horrifying portrait of the killer. The modus operandi was exact and unflinching. The intruder always waited until the darkest hours of the night to force entry, effortlessly prying open weak wooden doors or slipping through unlatched windows. He always attacked while his victims were submerged in deep sleep, utilizing a heavy axe to silence them before they could even draw breath to scream. Most disturbing of all was the ritualistic aftermath. The assailant refused to simply kill and flee. He dragged the bleeding bodies out of their beds and into the moonlit yards, posing them in the dirt as a gruesome exhibition for the morning light. By late summer, the sheer volume and identical nature of the murders became impossible for the authorities to ignore or brush off as unrelated domestic disputes. The local press seized upon the pattern, fueling a media frenzy that spread panic far beyond the city limits. Newspapers splashed sensational headlines across their front pages, explicitly connecting the dots between the slaughtered women. It was within these ink-stained columns that the terrifying reality was finally given a name. The journalists dubbed the mysterious butcher the Servant Girl Annihilator, a moniker that would soon echo through the decades. A paralyzing blanket of dread descended upon the working-class neighborhoods. African-American maids and cooks, realizing they were the primary targets of a roaming serial killer, categorically refused to sleep alone in their detached quarters. Women huddled together on the floors of shared rooms, keeping anxious vigils until dawn. Flimsy wooden doors were reinforced with whatever heavy furniture could be dragged in front of them, and windows were nailed firmly shut despite the suffocating summer heat. The night had transformed from a time of much-needed rest into a terrifying waiting game. Meanwhile, the wealthy citizens of Austin observed the rising panic from a comfortable distance. Ensconced within their fortified mansions and protected by private guards, the city's elite felt entirely safe behind their grand stone walls. They convinced themselves that the Annihilator was a menace confined strictly to the impoverished alleys, a monster who only preyed on the poor. But the Phantom was about to change his rules. How exactly do you catch a phantom in an era before modern criminal science? In the 1880s, the very concept of a serial killer, a predatory stranger murdering repeatedly solely for psychological gratification, was completely alien to local law enforcement. Furthermore, the shockingly primitive state of forensic science left investigators practically blind, even when standing in the middle of a blood-soaked crime scene. There was no DNA profiling to analyze a stray hair or a drop of sweat left on a shattered doorframe. There was no blood typing to distinguish the victim's blood from a potential wound sustained by the killer during a struggle. Even fingerprinting, a technique that would eventually revolutionize criminal investigations worldwide, was not yet an established practice in Texas law enforcement. Detectives could only stare in utter frustration at the muddy boot prints and bloody hand smudges left behind on wooden walls, entirely powerless to extract any meaningful identity from the gruesome physical evidence, driven by mounting public fury, scathing newspaper editorials, and their own profound desperation. The Austin police force resorted to the only investigative tactic they fully understood: a massive, indiscriminate dragnet. Operating under immense political pressure, lawmen swept through the working-class districts, kicking indoors and dragging bewildered men from their beds in the middle of the night. Over the course of the investigation, an astonishing number of suspects, more than 400 individuals in total, were brought into the precinct for rigorous, often heavy-handed questioning. The authorities primarily targeted local laborers, former lovers, and any male acquaintances of the slain women. They were desperately clinging to the outdated, traditional belief that murder was always a crime of passion, jealousy, or financial gain committed by someone intimately familiar with the victim. Yet, despite the overflowing jail cells and the relentless, exhausting interrogations, the police ultimately had absolutely nothing. Not a single piece of undeniable physical evidence connected any of the 400 detained men to the midnight butcheries. Every promising suspect eventually produced a verifiable alibi, or the timeline of their movements simply failed to align with the strikes. Even more maddening was the complete lack of visual identification. The few surviving witnesses, usually terrified neighbors or employers who had caught a fleeting glimpse of the attacker fleeing across a moonlit yard, could offer no concrete facial features. To them, the Annihilator was nothing more than a hulking, shadowy silhouette, a dark phantom slipping effortlessly into the surrounding Texas brush. The lawmen were utterly humiliated, outmatched by an adversary who left no traceable trail, as the total impotence of the police department became glaringly obvious. The atmosphere in Austin curdled into absolute, suffocating terror. Citizens quickly realized that a tin badge and a uniform could not protect them from the axe, prompting a drastic, citywide shift towards militant self-preservation. Vigilante committees were hastily formed in local taverns, with heavily armed posses patrolling the unlit dirt streets long after sundown. Fathers and husbands sat awake on their front porches, with loaded shotguns resting across their laps, their eyes intensely scanning the tree lines for any sudden, unnatural movement. The once bustling, optimistic capital transformed overnight into a grim fortress characterized by triple-locked doors, heavily boarded windows, and terrified, hushed whispers. The barking of a stray dog was no longer just a nuisance. It was an alarm bell that could send an entire neighborhood into a blind panic. Eventually, the relentless pace of the killings seemed to pause, as the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Texas summer finally gave way to the biting, cold winds of late autumn. A fragile, desperate hope began to take root across the exhausted city. With no new bodies discovered for several weeks, people reasoned that perhaps the shadowy butcher had succumbed to a fatal illness. Perhaps he had been locked up in another county for a lesser crime, or perhaps he had simply boarded a midnight freight train, taking his horrific hunt to another unsuspecting state. The weary citizens of Austin tentatively began to exhale, daring to believe that the phantom had moved on. They believed the nightmare was finally behind them. But the true nightmare was scheduled for December 24th, December 24, 1885, Christmas Eve, a night universally reserved for peace, reflection, and quiet celebration. Across the capital city, the oppressive fear that had choked Austin for a full 12 months was momentarily suspended. Inside the grand, brightly lit mansions of the wealthy, families gathered around crackling hearths, exchanging gifts and seeking solace in the warmth of the holiday season. The streets were blanketed in a deceptive stillness, and the city's elite felt entirely secure behind their thick oak doors and wrought iron gates. They went to sleep that night, convinced that the holy occasion, combined with their impenetrable social standing, would finally shield them from the darkness lurking in the alleys. But the phantom did not care for Christmas carols, nor did he care for the invisible boundaries of class. Sometime deep in the freezing hours of the night, the killer emerged once again from the shadows. However, this time, his path deviated entirely from the established pattern. He silently walked right past the fragile wooden servant quarters where he had previously hunted his prey. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the magnificent, fortified homes of Austin's aristocratic neighborhoods. The unspoken, comforting rule that this monster exclusively targeted the marginalized was about to be violently shattered. His chosen victims that night were two wealthy, prominent white women, Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips. Both women were highly respected members of Austin's affluent society, resting in completely separate residences that were considered fortresses of modern safety. Susan Hancock was asleep in her elegant home, while the young and affluent Eula Phillips lay in her own heavily secured bedroom in another part of the upscale district. They were women of extraordinary means, enveloped in luxury, entirely removed from the gritty struggles of the domestic workers who had perished before them. Yet, when the clock struck midnight, their privilege evaporated into the freezing air. The brutal reality of the Annihilator's return was horrifyingly identical to his previous strikes, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the same butcher was wielding the blade. The sturdy, expensive doors of both mansions were violently splintered and forced open with terrifying strength. The familiar, heavy axe was brought down with the exact same merciless precision, shattering the quiet sanctuary of their luxurious bedrooms. Despite their status, despite their wealth, and despite the supposed security of their prominent neighborhoods, both women met the exact same grotesque fate as Molly Smith and Eliza Shelley. The killer dragged their bleeding bodies from their soft, lavish beds and pulled them out into the biting winter night, leaving a horrific, identical signature in the manicured gardens of the elite. The sheer savagery of that night's home invasions also claimed an unintended casualty. As the violence spilled through the elegant hallways, the chaos led to devastating collateral damage. A male victim, desperately attempting to intervene and halt the nocturnal slaughter of the women in his household, was brutally struck down by the Phantom's axe. The killer was no longer just a stealthy assassin hunting isolated maids. He was a hurricane of unchecked violence, willing to butcher absolutely anyone who stood between him and his twisted desires. When the sun finally rose on Christmas morning, it illuminated a city fundamentally broken by terror. The news of the elite women's murders spread like wildfire, replacing holiday cheer with screams of visceral panic. The ultimate realization crashed over the capital. Absolutely no one was safe. The rigid Victorian shields of class, race, and vast wealth offered absolutely no protection against the Annihilator. If this shadowy figure could effortlessly breach the grandest estates in town and butcher the wives of powerful men on the holiest night of the year, then every single citizen was a potential target. The capital was plunged into an unprecedented state of hysteria, with terrified residents flocking to the train stations, desperate to escape the cursed city limits before night fell again. As the blood-soaked year of 1885 drew to a close, desperate city officials prepared to declare martial law. They heavily armed the police force and fortified the streets, fully expecting the upcoming year of 1886 to be an absolute bloodbath. They braced themselves for an all-out war against an unstoppable monster. But then, complete silence. The brutal events of Christmas Eve 1885 shattered the last remaining fragments of Austin's composure. The slaughter of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, two prominent white women murdered in the very heart of the city's wealthiest enclaves, elevated the crisis from a localized tragedy to a statewide emergency. The intense, suffocating pressure on the local police department reached an absolute boiling point. The mayor and the city council were virtually paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public outrage, facing terrified citizens who were now heavily armed and teetering on the edge of mob violence. Forced into desperate action, the governor of Texas finally intervened. He offered massive financial rewards for any information leading to an arrest, a bounty large enough to tempt even the most loyal confidant. Private detectives, including seasoned operatives from the renowned Pinkerton National Detective Agency, were quietly dispatched to the capital. They roamed the muddy streets in long coats, interrogating informants and trailing suspects through the winter chill, determined to claim the reward and restore order to the terrified metropolis. The city, fortified and shivering, braced itself for an absolute bloodbath in the new year. Yet, the anticipated bloodbath never arrived. Instead, the deafening roar of violence was abruptly replaced by an eerie, deeply unsettling silence. January of 1886 passed without a single shattered wooden door. February followed. The winter snows began to melt into the Texas soil. But the phantom did not emerge from the shadows. The midnight intrusions, the dragged bodies, the bloody axes left in the dirt. All of the horrifying rituals simply stopped. The killer had vanished just as quickly and mysteriously as he had first appeared on that freezing night in December 1884. There were no boastful, taunting letters sent to the local press, no final terrifying public displays, and absolutely no clues left behind to indicate why the relentless slaughter had suddenly ceased. When the dust finally settled and the paralyzed city dared to tentatively breathe again, the final tally of the phantom's reign of terror was grimly recorded. Within the span of exactly 1 calendar year, the Servant Girl Annihilator had successfully committed 8 gruesome murders. 7 women and 1 man had been butchered in the dead of night, their lives violently extinguished in the supposed safety of their own beds. And yet, the scales of justice remained completely unbalanced. Despite the massive dragnet, the unprecedented deployment of elite private investigators, and the staggering interrogation of over 400 individual suspects, the authorities had failed spectacularly. Not a single person was ever successfully convicted of the crimes. The massive, chaotic files of the Austin Police Department slowly gathered dust in the archives, filled with dead ends, the ruined reputations of the falsely accused, and the terrifying, undeniable realization that the law had been entirely outsmarted by a ghost. As the years turned into decades, the haunting reality of the unsolved case settled over the Texas capital like a thick fog, leaving behind a profound, lingering mystery. The abrupt, unexplained disappearance of the killer spawned countless theories, each more desperate than the last. Where exactly did he go? Did the phantom succumb to a sudden fatal illness, dying unrecognized in a local charity hospital? Was he quietly incarcerated for a lesser, unrelated crime, living out his days in a cramped jail cell without anyone ever realizing his true, monstrous identity? Or did the mounting pressure of the Pinkerton detectives and the massive state rewards simply force his hand? Perhaps he packed a small leather bag, walked to the bustling Austin depot under the cover of darkness, and simply boarded a midnight train, seeking out a brand new, unsuspecting hunting ground far away from the Texas heat. For over a century, American criminologists have debated these exact questions, trying to map the trajectory of an apex predator. The idea that a killer of such immense, sadistic brutality could simply turn off his violent urges overnight contradicts almost everything modern psychology understands about serial killers. They rarely stop voluntarily. They are usually caught, killed, or forced to relocate. And it is precisely this chilling psychological profile that has led to one of the most mind-bending theories in the history of true crime. Some historians believe the Annihilator didn't stop hunting. He just crossed the ocean. When a predator of such immense, overwhelming violence simply ceases to strike, the human mind desperately searches for a logical explanation. In the decades following the Christmas Eve massacre, investigators, journalists, and modern criminologists have relentlessly debated the ultimate fate of the Servant Girl Annihilator, trying to unravel the why behind his sudden disappearance. The most grounded and historically accepted hypothesis points toward the theory of the local madman. Given the utter lack of modern psychiatric understanding in 1880s Texas, many experts believe the killer was either a roaming transient or a seemingly ordinary local resident who had succumbed to a brief, intensely violent period of psychosis. Once that horrific fever broke, the murders naturally stopped. It is entirely plausible that the Annihilator eventually succumbed to a fatal disease, took his own life in a moment of clarity, or was quietly locked away in a primitive, forgotten asylum under a different name for a completely unrelated crime. His monstrous true identity never realized by his wardens. But there is another hypothesis, one so mind-bending and deeply unsettling, that it has captivated true crime historians for over a century. What if the apex predator of Austin didn't die? And what if he wasn't locked away? What if he simply realized that his Texas hunting ground had become too heavily fortified, prompting him to seek out a much larger, darker labyrinth? It is a documented, historical fact that the Servant Girl Annihilator vanished into thin air in late December 1885. Less than 3 years later, in August 1888, the foggy, cobblestone streets of London's Whitechapel district began to run red with the blood of Mary Ann Nichols. Jack the Ripper had arrived. Could America's first serial killer and Britain's most notorious monster be the exact same person? While it sounds like the sensational plot of a Victorian penny dreadful, there is a tangible, historical thread connecting the two baffling cases. During the chaotic dragnet in Texas, a Malay cook named Maurice was heavily scrutinized by the Austin Police Department. He had been employed at a local hotel and was known to have resided in close proximity to the locations of several of the Servant Girl murders. Shortly after the bloodshed stopped in Austin, Maurice abruptly left the state. According to historical records and contemporary newspaper reports from the era, he secured passage on a ship and traveled directly to London, arriving shortly before the infamous Whitechapel murders began. Both the Austin Phantom and the London Butcher shared a deep, pathological hatred for marginalized, lower-class women. Both men struck in the dead of night, slipping through the shadows to butcher their victims with a level of savagery and mutilation that completely stunned seasoned medical examiners. Skeptics and forensic historians, however, are quick to point out the glaring differences in their distinct methods of operation. The Annihilator was a brazen home invader who wielded a heavy, blunt force axe, shattering wooden doors and dragging his victims from the intimate safety of their beds out into moonlit yards. Jack the Ripper, conversely, was an outdoor street predator who stalked the foggy, open alleyways, utilizing a sharp surgical knife to perform rapid, precise anatomical mutilations before melting back into the London smog. Criminal psychologists generally agree that a serial killer drastically changing his weapon of choice and his exact modus operandi is incredibly rare. Yet, they also note that the underlying psychological signature, the overwhelming, sadistic need to completely dominate, violently mutilate, and deliberately display the ruined bodies of vulnerable women to shock the public, remains eerily, undeniably similar. Whether the Austin Phantom crossed the Atlantic and morphed into the Whitechapel Butcher, or whether he simply bled out in a dusty, anonymous Texas ditch, the most terrifying aspect of the Servant Girl Annihilator case is the absolute lack of resolution. Stripped of the theories and the urban legends, we are forced to confront a deeply disturbing reality. America's very first documented serial killer got away with it completely. He committed 8 horrific, bloody murders, plunged an entire capital city into a state of absolute, paralyzing paranoia, outsmarted hundreds of lawmen, and then simply walked away without a scratch. For a time, he existed in the daylight. he walked freely among the public, perhaps buying a newspaper to read about his own atrocities, passing terrified citizens on the dirt sidewalks, nodding at the very police officers who were desperately hunting him, and ultimately taking his monstrous, bloody secret to the grave. Today, the Servant Girl Annihilator remains one of the darkest, bloodiest, and most baffling unsolved chapters in American history. It is a chilling narrative of a rapidly modernizing capital city completely brought to its knees by an invisible, relentless predator. Yet, despite holding the grim title of the nation's very first documented serial killer, this horrific case has been largely relegated to the obscure footnotes of criminal history. It has been permanently overshadowed by the towering, legendary myth of Jack the Ripper that captured the world's imagination just a few short years later. While the foggy alleys of Whitechapel became immortalized in countless books, blockbuster films, and international folklore, the blood-soaked snow of Austin quietly melted away. The visceral panic of 1885 slowly faded, and the tragic memory of those 8 brutally slaughtered victims, mostly vulnerable women who were simply trying to survive in a harsh world, was unjustly swept under the rug of time. Yet, the truth of what happened during that terrifying year cannot be completely erased. Somewhere deep within the dusty, forgotten archives of Texas, buried under a literal mountain of yellowed police reports, frantic telegrams, and century-old testimonies, the true identity of a monster is likely still hiding in plain sight. He was the ultimate phantom of the American Victorian era, a nameless, faceless ghost who completely owned the night for one terrifying, exceptionally violent year before slipping effortlessly back into the absolute darkness from which he came. The humble servant quarters he invaded have long since been torn down, and the muddy dirt roads he stalked are now paved over with modern, bustling concrete. But the profound terror he inflicted remains permanently etched into the very foundation of the city. He proved to the people of the 1880s that no locked door was truly safe, and that monsters do not just exist in frightening fairy tales. This profound lack of closure leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling question to ponder as we close this bloody historical chapter. Looking at the eerie similarities in their psychological profiles and their shared, violent hatred for marginalized women, do you personally believe that the Austin Phantom eventually crossed the Atlantic to become the infamous Jack the Ripper? Did he carry his midnight butchery from the Texas frontier all the way to the cobblestone streets of London? Or was the Servant Girl Annihilator a completely different, uniquely American monster who simply vanished into the desolate Texas dust, perhaps living out the rest of his natural life as a seemingly normal, quiet neighbor? I want to hear your perspective on this unsolved puzzle. If you found this deep dive into historical true crime fascinating and want to support uncovering more forgotten, dark mysteries from the past, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to leave your own theories about the Annihilator's true identity, his sudden disappearance, and the Ripper connection in the comments section down below. Every single interaction really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep producing these highly detailed documentaries for you. Thank you for walking through the darkest alleys of history with me today. Keep your doors locked, stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next mystery.